people who have worked at psychiatric wards, who was the most troubled patient you worked with? I worked in the dental clinic of a psychiatric hospital for a bit, and I'll never forget a patient named Terry. Terry loved to wear little girls' clothing and would have pictures of little girls that he had cut out of magazines on a string around his neck. When I first encountered him, I automatically made the assumption that he was some sort of pedo. I later learned from the dentist I had worked with that Terry had witnessed his little sister being brutally abused and hit by their stepfather when they were children. He had in a way started to assume the identity of his little sister, and he considered the girls in the pictures he cut out his friends. I felt horrible for jumping to conclusions, especially after I got to know him more and saw what a gentle, kind soul he was. Story 2. I worked on a juvenile psych unit. I had to put a girl in restraints that included her head because she was so want to end her life and distraught that she was biting her own shoulder. Maybe 3 years later, I took a bus to interview for a graduate psych program. When I switched buses, a nicely dressed girl asked me if I was from Colorado. I said yes. Then she asked me if I worked on a psych unit. It was her, all better. We chatted for a while, and I told her how happy I was to see her doing so well. She smiled, thanked me, and we said our goodbyes. Story 3. In a day treatment facility I volunteered for, I led a writing group to help people develop goals and motivation to continue in treatment. One woman gave really strong and compelling answers about wanting to improve her health, to be a better wife and mother, have the energy to run around and play with her kids, etc. Several weeks after beginning the group, I mentioned this to another therapist who informs me this woman has no husband or children and never has. Story 4. Brain damage can be absolutely horrific. Broken humans that don't work anymore, and nobody knows what to do with them. There was one guy who had brain damage from infant meningitis. The guy's about 50 years old now, but he's exactly like what you might imagine a lobotomized person to look like. Totally vacant, staring eyes, jaw hanging down with a continuous thread of dribble rolling off his bottom lip, arms hanging down by his sides. And all he does is pace up and down whatever room his is in, all day and all night, until he collapses asleep after about 5 days, sleeps 12 hours, wakes up and resumes pacing. He wears an adult nappy diaper because he is totally incontinent, and changing it is remarkably difficult because he won't stop pacing even while people are trying to clean him up. He cannot eat by himself. He cannot do anything by himself. The only verbal speech he produces is a loud goo-goo-goo, like a propeller engine starting up. There's nothing there in his mind at all. He's a husk. He never smiles, never frowns, give no indication of any aspiration or want. That has been his entire life. He has no purpose, has required 24-hour care his entire life, and I don't think there's a single person who has ever worked with him that wouldn't have gladly taken him outside and hit him if they were allowed to. Anybody opposed to euthanasia hasn't seen real brain damage. Anyone who can't understand why doctors give up trying to resuscitate after a certain point where irreversible brain damage has occurred have not seen real brain damage. Anyone upset about the doctors ending Charlie Gard's life haven't seen real brain damage. They should transport the guy I described between hospitals to show family members what the doctors are talking about when they say that a person should be allowed to die. Story 5. I was in a juvenile psych unit. A 16-year-old kid was in for abusing. He was court-ordered to be there for a period of time. I found out that he was abused by his father. I asked him where he would be going after release because he couldn't go back into his home with his sister. He told me his father had found a camper and put it at a lake, and he would be living there until he graduated. Yes, the same father that abused him. His head was so ducked. Story 6. I had a kid once that kept freaking out during the night shift. He was from South America and kept babbling in Spanish about demons coming to get him, and I barely understand Spanish, so there wasn't much I could do to calm him down. He abruptly stopped screaming and went dead silent with huge eyes, looking directly at something behind me. I turned around, and there was nothing there, but he kept staring anyway. I didn't get much sleep after that shift. Story 7. I did a mental health co-op in high school. I would have to say, a tie exists between the two most troubling patients that I encountered while doing my co-op. One was a guy who had Korsakoff syndrome. This guy was completely delusional and dissociated from time and location. He thought at times he was at a bowling alley, and at other times he thought he had just gone shopping for shoes. They had to tie him into his chair because he could sometimes become violent. A small percentage of alcoholics get Korsakoff. Most of them die before it sets in, but about 2% of all alcoholics will get this disorder. The other patient was someone with severe brain damage who had to be kept locked naked in a padded cell with access to nothing she could put in her mouth because she would continually try to eat anything. She ate styrofoam cups, plastic cutlery, plates, etc. Story 8. I worked in a psych hospital for a couple months between undergrad and grad school. We were a short-term facility that mostly took crisis clients. However, we had some people who were there for months, while waiting for a bed at the state hospital an hour away. There are two patients which I think about on a semi-regular basis. One was a long-term client. He was diagnosed with severe treatment-refractory schizophrenia. He had been diagnosed with early-onset schizophrenia in his teenage years, 60s when I knew him, and had been in and out of psychiatric hospitals his whole life. His formal thought disorder was so bad that his speech was almost unintelligible, and he had a guardian ad litem to make decisions for him. When I started, he had already been there about 2 months, and everyone knew him. He was nice enough, and pretty much all he wanted in the world was a cigarette, which he couldn't have. He caused issues now and then, slapped a female patient with his hard once, and so I started getting put on one-to-ones with him. We started to get to know each other, and he learned to like me a little. He got really frustrated and punched me in the back of the head. The next day, he came up to me, said, "Sorry, Juba," what he called me, and gave me a hug. He left for the state hospital the day before my last day. The other was a short-term client at the very end of my time there. He was a young guy who had tested positive for HIV and started experiencing death thoughts as a result. He cried the entire time he was there. He wouldn't talk much and wasn't eating. Story 9. Kid that was completely dissociative. Would randomly just start screaming, asking his mother to stop hitting him. He was pretty low functioning, so it was really hard to process. He would look at me and tell me how she beat him. The doctor believed that the young man felt like he was in safe environment for the first time in his life, and his mind was allowing him to re-remember past trauma. Story 10. I have spent time inside a few different psychiatric facilities. I met a lot of interesting folks. Many years ago, there was a lady with horrific burn scars from her head down her entire body. She was chronically depressed. She was very badly disfigured. She was just the sweetest person ever. Always a kind word for anyone and happy to listen. I bugged one of the nurses to tell me why she was covered in burns. I was told she set herself on fire after losing her baby. Story 11. I did 6 or 8 weeks of mostly inpatient psych during my 3rd year of medical school. Here are the ones that stand out. 1. Borderline personality disorder guy. Adamant about end his life, and thus had all the normal things taken away. Nobody could have shoelaces, and he had one-on-one supervision. Check in one morning, and the dude is covered with little patches of blood. He somehow used the paper plate from dinner or breakfast to attempt death by paper cuts. 2. Schizophrenic dude, super nice guy. Grossly disorganized behavior, hadn't cut his fingernails in months kind of thing. Kept talking about meeting up with his buddy in 3 years to do business, and had to wait 3 years because of the migration and climate change. Cool, no big deal. But I looked through his papers, and he had written like 4 letters to the State Department of Treasury or whoever, going on and on about loans and money owed, using very flowery language, and each time attaching a check for $1. His final letter's the one that got him in trouble when he said he needed the funds to buy a revolver, several cases of ammunition, flak hand grenades, and a guillotine. The Office of the Treasury wrote a return check for the value of the $4 he had sent them. Third dude in the emergency department, convinced he needed to be the ultimate military warrior, and so he would grab the packet of tissues, or his own shoes, and do bicep curls with them, like super fast, and make hyper eye contact with you through the window in his room. 4. Don't remember what this lady was in for, but she had a new complaint that aliens had put something inside of her. Turned out she had appendicitis. So talking her through why we needed to do different tests and stuff was a balance of entertaining her, so we could treat her and also being objective about what was happening. 5th pediatric ward. Kid had oppositional defiant disorder, I think. Little guy was like 10 years old, cool kid, but would always push the envelope, as to be expected with his condition. Otherwise, we were cool with each other. We were doing arts and crafts. I was making a really crafty glitter drawing of a cat, and he turns to the coordinator and yells, "Doctor just hit me in the side with the safety scissors." The coordinator looks at me and asks if I did that. "No, of course not." And then I muttered, "Maybe too loud, maybe not loud enough, but I may be about to." Odd out with it. Schizophrenic dude, super cool guy, non-compliant with his medications. Understandably, antipsychotic meds have some rough side effects, but as a result had had many psychotic breakthrough episodes that had slowly chipped away at his baseline cognitive performance. So, in addition to the medications slowing him down, he was also quite sedated, blunted, loved hip-hop, could talk to you about any band or artist in detail, and loved to rap, but was horrible at rapping. He'd say 3 lines and then get to the rhyme and kind of get distracted or say whatever rhyme is equivalent to a dad joke. 7. One of the other med students there lived in a small town where apparently they had a super high number of psych cases. As a result, we'd be doing rounds, and occasionally a patient would wave, "Hey buddy, sorry, no Swiss cheese today," because they worked at the deli he'd go to. Or he'd recognize a girl from the checkout desk at the pharmacy, or a guy that was always at the library, etc. He recognized like 1 out of every 12 patients there from outside of the ward. My takeaway, most of the people there were cool, just had hit a rough spot and were in the wrong place at the wrong time, or had been dealing with their own health conditions and needed some protected time to get back to baseline. The biggest difference that I saw was whether or not the patients had introspection into their condition. If they were aware that their delusions weren't real, they seemed to do all right. If they actually did think spiders were trying to steal their thoughts, real story, then they seemed to have a longer path forward. Story 12. Work in an ER often have PTs come to us during an acute crisis. This is a small town, so we have a lot of recurring faces. My favorite is a man who is schizophrenic and loosely related to me, actually. Last time he came in, escorted by police, he went on and on and on about being a free man on the land and how he didn't consent to treatment. He had called a hotline, and the hotline had called 911, which I think is bees, but that's neither here nor there, and told the responding officers of his very well thought out plan to end life. When that happens, you're being court committed. There's no consent needed to keep you from end life. He had all the supplies bought, and he has attempted it several times before. He had a lot of details worked out. Anyway, he went on and on, pacing, having flight of ideas that were so drastic, and frankly, they were happening so quickly, and he changed reins so rapidly that his was impressive. He called us every name in the book, told me he hated nurses, how he could do my job in his sleep, how he could get the same degree in 5 years, took me 2, but okay, how we better be ready for a deposition because he was suing all of us, and asked how much money I was making off of him, being there in the Irsch, over and over. He also asked the cops how much they were making doing this to him, which we were all handling him okay, but eventually, after hours, this wears on your nerves, and a deputy answered that he was a volunteer deputy, so he wasn't being paid anything. Q crying, screaming, "Why would you tell me that, man? Thanks for making me feel worthless." More pacing and screaming in a tiny-assed, open Bay Air. But the weird thing was, anytime I actually needed anything from him, like his vitals, blood, urine, to listen to his heart and lungs, I'd tell him what I needed for the next step of our process, and he would go off the deep end ranting about being a free man on the land again, telling me to Google it, screaming, pacing. Yet, as soon as I actually had to do it, he turned into a lamb. No issues getting blood and EKG, and I examined him closely while he just chatted away and apologized for calling me names. Honestly, he was probably trying to manipulate me, but I took the reprieve at face value because we all needed it, and he was very pleasant for 10-minute stretches. Lo and behold, his blood alcohol level was 3 times the legal limit. Mix that with his bevy of psych substances, and here we are. We couldn't get him in to see the psychiatrist until his level goes down. This is to get a proper assessment, even though he's clearly not just drunk, but having a pretty serious psychiatric crisis. Shortly after we told him this, he had calmed down enough to be chatting amicably with the deputy who was working for free. He lost his crap and got in my face and another nurse's face while we were at the ER desk. And although I didn't feel threatened physically, our air doctor told the officers to get him out and that he was done with this for the night, and he wasn't going to hold everyone hostage in the ER with his antics, when we had other patients there too. Patients spent the night in jail to sober up, and I believe finished the psych intake process in the morning. I'm not saying this is what should have happened, but that's what happened. The thing is, this guy is absolutely brilliant. Very high IQ, very kind, sweet, and gentle. When he's on his meds and not drinking, of course. He is a pacifist and genuinely a giving and caring man. He can play any instrument you hand him, just by ear. He's wonderful to chat with, and you can have some very eye-opening conversations with him normally. It's such a stark contrast to when I see him in the ER, but it just shows you how badly mental illness ducks. With you, sadly, he was abused as a child and forced to abuse his siblings. He grew up and acquired a substances problem, which may have contributed to his schizophrenia. He is clean and is largely compliant with his medication. I've had a lot of psych patients, but he's probably the most troubled and troubling one I know and see regularly. Story 13. Young man who was suffering from substances-induced psychosis. He had smoked and was taken to out hospital with involuntary status. He stayed for over a month with no signs of remission. He covered the entire spectrum of psychotic behaviors during his stay, but the worst was when he would pop into reality for a moment. The look of sheer terror in his face and the shaky voice have stuck with me. His family broke down during visitation, and only his father could manage weekly visits afterwards. Chemically induced psychosis, from my experience, is game over most of the time. I've seen a few people recover to a degree, but never fully. Don't duck with substances. Story 14. Group home for the mentally disabled. One guy was elderly and had Down syndrome. Super sweet. But come time for a shower, he would break down and apologize. I'm sorry, literally crying. I believe he was likely abused with cold showers or cold hose water as a form of punishment when he was young. Story 15. I worked for a psych nurse and interviewed her for a uni assignment on this very question. She said she had a lady who hit a man who looked like her sister's abuser. Wasn't him, was an all-round awful situation, but was the sweetest, most motherly, caring older woman. Another guy who kept a guy for some period of time, like kidnapped him. She had been a nurse on 2 electroshock sessions and said one woman was deadly bedridden depressed in what sounded like an extreme breakdown kind of way, and had it, and the next day turned 180 degrees from it. For her, it was super effective. Had a runaway that ended in a big manhunt. Never a dull moment. She did, however, refuse to work in the critical, might be the wrong word, ward. She said it was too hard, which I took to mean too depressing. Story 16. Had a dementia patient, among other things I imagine, but I was just the nursing assistant. I don't get much for patient histories, just whether they can walk unassisted or poo on their own. She was a very kind, sweet old lady. She thought of herself as a young mother, so she carried a doll with her, wrapped in a blanket. She was even allowed a baby bed, and every night she would tuck her baby in beside her bed. Then she would talk about the baby growing inside her belly. She would go on very coherently about her pregnancy and her child. She had me believing she lived in this sweet fantasy land that was set on repeat. But it would all abruptly end and start over once her baby was due, and there was no new baby. She would mope for about a month, super depressed, not eating, non-stop crying. She could not be consoled. She'd get fairly violent. Then it would start over. She'd just wake up one morning and as happy as could be. "Did you hear the great news? I'm going to have another baby." One night she got all tucked in and forgot to tuck her baby in. I noticed and said, "I can tuck Susan in for the night," and reached in to get her baby. The woman throat punched me hard. I dropped the baby doll when I fell over gasping for air. She then started to lose it as she was trying to further assault me, yelling at me about driving too fast and destroying everything she loved. Once the dust settled, it was shared with me that she was pregnant once upon a time, and she already had a 1-year-old the husband, and the 1-year-old got in an accident on the way to the hospital. They both passed. She was so distraught over it, she gave the newborn up for adoption. That's why her delusions start over after the due date, and she is so mad in between. I imagine some residual guilt, anger for her loss, is what caused her to throat punch me for taking her doll. When I first started working there, I just thought she was some fun old delusional lady. I never expected the delusions to have backstory. It's heartbreaking dementia. Seems horrifying enough when it's described as being confused or losing your mind. But it seems so much worse when it's repeat your worst life experience over and over until you die. To constantly be stuck in the time leading up to your most traumatic experience and reliving it over and over. The very definition of hell, in my opinion. Story 17. So a little backstory is, my mom is a physical therapist for the developmentally disabled and traumatic brain injuries. There are all types of troubled people and incredibly sad stories of how they got there. The one I'm thinking of in particular refers to a paranoid schizophrenic. Let's say her name is Jane. I have met her before, but she was one of my mom's patients, so I'm getting this story from my mom's point of view. So, Jane was born completely normal as a healthy, functioning person. She was actually extremely intelligent and compassionate. She became a pediatric psychiatrist for terminally ill children in a NYC hospital, don't remember which. She married her husband, who was a successful psychologist. Both were very happy, in love, successful, and well off. I believe they lived in a very nice apartment of 5th Avenue in NYC. One day out of the blue, Jane had a stroke and went into a coma. The doctor said that the coma was indefinite. Whilst in the coma, Jane's husband has heart attack and pass. A few weeks later, Jane awakes from the coma, but immediately it is obvious that the stroke caused serious damage. She has extreme weakness and paralysis on one side of her body. In truth, I'm not entirely sure how it works, but soon after they let Jane know that while she was in the coma, her husband passed from a heart attack. I'm not sure how schizophrenia really works, but from there she very quickly started suffering from extreme paranoia, delusions, and other schizo-type things. Her thing was that she thought her husband hired people to torture. Years later, where my mom met her, she was deep in the schizophrenia. She lived in a house alone but had attendants that would constantly check in on her, and she needed to make routine visits to doctors. In addition to numerous other things, she needed to go shopping almost every day because she believed at night people would break in and poison all of her food. She could only buy vacuum-sealed and packaged food, nothing fresh. She would scream at anyone that got close to the property and constantly accuse staff members of beating and abuse her, using non-existent cuts and bruises as evidence. The now is where the story gets really weird. One night, my mom's friend, her primary physician, got a call from the hospital that Jane is acting really weird, and the doctors do not know what's going on. She is talking weird and not making any sense and has no balance. They want her physician to come in immediately. At first, they believe she's having another stroke, but they soon rule that out. They run some more tests and find out that she is piss drunk. This is impossible. Jane's diet is closely monitored, and alcohol is strictly prohibited as it would interact with her medications. Nevertheless, a team is sent to her house to search for any possible alcohol. They find nothing, despite saying they really tore the house apart and looked everywhere possible. Then they think maybe somebody gave her alcohol to her. But again, that seems impossible, as she lives in the middle of nowhere. And on top of all that, she is a paranoid schizophrenic. She wouldn't open her door for anyone, let alone accept anything to drink from them. Some thought maybe she went and bought some, but she lives miles from the nearest grocery store. And at this point, she's as a little old lady who still has weakness and paralysis on one side of her body. She can barely walk and would obviously not accept a ride from anyone. They gave her fluids and let her rest, and by the next day she was sobered up, but obviously had no recollection of the previous day. Blackout. To this day, nobody knows, and it has never happened again. It was probably 5 or 6 years ago now. Everyone just kind of chalks it up to a, that was weird kind of thing. The most plausible explanation the doctors gave was a spontaneous example of auto-brewery syndrome, which is when changes in metabolism cause you to secrete ethanol getting you drunk. Yeah, pretty weird. Story 18. I was a psych worker at a day program for adolescent outpatients. The city I lived in had a massive shortage of beds in psych units, so we ended up getting a whole lot of kids who really belonged in inpatient care. A couple of the most memorable ones. One girl was convinced that YouTube was a secret way for the government to communicate with her, and only her. She would open up random videos and start conversing or arguing with them. Because she thought she was looking at a live video chat with a government agent, she would scream at other kids if she saw them watching YouTube videos, because she thought it was just for her. Every now and then she would get up from the computer and start taking all of her clothes off, or smearing her lipstick on her face. One of those cases that sounds funny on paper, but is absolutely gut-wrenching to watch. We had a kid who had pretty much been raised in a series of hotel rooms from a young age because he was so violent that he burned his bridges with every group home, residential placement, and appropriate foster home in the city. The final straw came when he was about 8 or 9. Out of nowhere, he tried to gouge his foster father's eyes hit while he was driving at highway speeds. After that, they kept him in hotel rooms with a rotating cast of social workers and youth workers to provide one-to-one supervision. He was messed up before, but that kind of childhood pretty much did him in. We had one girl who was trying to manage her depression, anxiety, and be a better parent to her 2-year-old. Typical stuff. She'd been with us for a couple of months when out of nowhere, she comes in completely hysterical, screaming that her daughter was found passed that morning. We freaked out and called up her caseworker, only to find out that there was no kid, never had been. She'd talked about this kid for months in great detail, and we'd never thought to report it to her caseworker because we had no reason to doubt she was telling the truth. Next day, she came in vacant and deadpan and nonchalantly told us that her fictional and now dead kid had been hit by a bus in front of her that morning. Back to the hospital she went. We had a kid with a double whammy of fetal alcohol issues and brain damage from a childhood hit and run. He lost his ability to hear thoughts in his own head and had absolutely zero impulse control. I don't mean couldn't help himself from eating a second cookie. I mean zero. Whatever thoughts came into his mind came out of his mouth in real time. If he saw something he wanted to put in his mouth, it went into his mouth. He once ate all the staples out of a stapler before staff noticed what he was doing. He would pull drinks out of the fridge and dump them over his own head, bash himself in the face with sporting equipment, and just drop his pants and pee whenever he felt like it. He had an IQ in the normal range, just a unique form of brain damage. We had to have 2 staff on him at all times just to keep him from traumatizing the other kids. I also think it's worth noting that before I went to work with brain damage patients, my boyfriend rode a motorcycle. After I started coming home with work stories, he gave it up. Seriously, people, brain damage is no joke. Wear your helmets, fasten your seatbelts, and for the love of God, don't drive drunk. Story 19. Without too much detail, probably the man who had hit his child. That was many years before I knew him, and he had settled down completely by the time I cared for him. Roughly happened at least 60 years before I started. It was challenging at first, because he was schizophrenic, but had committed the crime before being diagnosed properly. I felt a lot of sympathy, and he was the walking personification of regret if ever I've seen it. You could talk to him normally, but he'd always have the 1,000-yard stare. I came away from the mental health hospital with a great deal of empathy for the patients, and this was geriatric care, so they had to live with some horrible crap all their lives. I'd also do my best to keep a relative from a mental health hospital, if at all possible. Story 20. Butter knife. I worked security at a local hospital for 6 months. It was a terrible job, and I wasn't cut out for it mentally, but there was one guy who I'll always remember. We called him Butter Knife because of an incident from before I started where he got food delivered to his room in the psych area, and the kitchen forgot to take out the plastic knife. He knew he wasn't allowed to have it, and upon discovering the cutlery, He flipped out, jumped on the bed, and stomped his cheeseburger while screaming at the nurses how he shouldn't have a butter knife. Somehow, he responded well to people in uniform, even if that uniform is 2 sizes too large and loosely hanging off my skinny frame like a scarecrow's clothes. He took a liking to me since I talked to him like I would talk to anyone. I treated him like a person, not a patient. For a reason I can't remember. Security got called to his room to restrain him to the bed. I think he was refusing his medications because he didn't like shots. Can't blame him there, but his medication that day included a shot. In comes 3 large dudes with muscles and heft, and 1 kid with a popsicle silhouette. When he saw the U.S. coming, he cooled off and accepted his fate, or so we thought. I was in charge of holding and restraining his left arm, which is the easiest of the 4 limbs. He was calm and let us do our thing, only responding here and there with, "I don't want to do this." Luck of the draw when picking keys and walkie-talkies earlier, I didn't have a restraint key on my keychain. So I waited with his left hand while the other dudes wrapped up. He noticed I wasn't doing much, so he started moving his hands slowly in circular patterns. I kept a firm grip, but let him move a bit. Before anyone had fully tightened their restraints, Butterknife flipped out because I wasn't holding him strongly enough. With more strength than a horse on steroids, Butterknife clenched and pulled his arm away from me, kicked another officer, and generally got free. Cue a cartoon football tackle, where 3 macho pear-shaped dudes pile on top of each other. On top of Butterknife, a nurse or 2 join in, and I swing around to each appendage to tighten and fully restrain him. He needed a lap belt, too, for trying to air duck his way out of his holding. Butterknife was scarred from head to toe from self-mutilation, and for generally getting into fights with people he should not be fighting. He was well known around the hospital, having stayed in the psych area for several months out of the year. He was always an issue for one reason or another. Last time I saw him was on the outside. He was sitting at the corner of a shopping center, clearly homeless. I pulled into the shopping center, saw him, and decided to go to a different store across town. I doubt he'd recognize me outside of the hospital, and without my security costume. But the last thing I need is a troubled guy getting chummy while I pick out cucumbers. Story 21. Worked security in a hospital with a psych ward. A huge man named John, not real name, was a regular guest, also known as a frequent flyer. John was a 6'7", 53 years old, black male, think Michael Clark Duncan, who to the uninitiated was a very intimidating presence. John suffered from severe schizophrenia, which had started at an early age, and he had been taking anti-schizo meds for almost 40 years. It was to the point that the meds didn't always work anymore, and if they upped the dosage, it would have killed him quite soon. As it was, the meds were already slowly hit his liver. John had retired from a major auto manufacturer after 30 years, and had also been a preacher. All the while, it seemed like John was still in there like a helpless observer, desperately trying to regain control. I can honestly say we had quadruple the amount of calls to that wing when John was visiting. As huge and as intimidating as he was, he never hurt anyone despite 100 threats from him that he would. We found out that he had passed away at the age of 54, mainly due to the damage the meds had caused to his system over the years. To this day, I'm honestly sad when I think about it. Not sure if this is the type of troubled you were looking for, but for me, his situation seemed the most troubling because there was no way out for him. Either let complete insanity take control or let the meds slowly kill him. So I don't end on a sad note. The funniest thing I ever saw John do, schizophrenia itself is not funny, but you have to find humor in some things or that job will drive you nuts, was stand up in front of a group watching TV, throw his robe off, thus making him naked, and proceed to announce, "All you mother duckers can suck my junk," to which the entire wing of patients all left what they were doing and huddled around the nurse's station until we showed up. One of the patients looked me dead in the face and said, "We might be crazy, but we're not that crazy." Pretty much said it all. John, I hope the afterlife treated you better than life did. Story 22. I worked at a medium secure forensic mental health hospital. Male, 18 to 64, criminal conviction. A gentleman who, when I first began working there, seemed like a lovely guy, though at times quick to anger and delusional. He had bipolar disorder, and I believe I met him in a hypomanic manic state. We had 2 rehab wards, lowest risk, 2 continuing care wards, medium risk, where I worked mostly, 1 acute ward, high, with a sub-intensive care ward, very high, and single seclusion room, for emergencies only and requiring substantial medical and legal paperwork reviewed every 24 hours. Any patient spending excessive time in the room would have to go to a high-secure hospital, such as Broadmoor. This patient had crushing lows and was soon moved from my ward to the intensive care ward. His death risk was such that he required direct observation 24 hours a day. He was still allowed to shave with a safety razor, and of course, under direct OB as potentially dangerous objects, were in a security room and counted in and out, etc. The issue that arose is that the razor is counted out simply as razor and then returned. This patient had somehow, under one-to-one observations, managed to remove a blade from the razor, like a Mach 3 or whatever, that has whatever number of blades, and hide it. It was simply counted back and razor returned. An undetermined amount of time later, he suddenly slammed the door of his room. Staff would sit in front of the open door watching, and barricade it, then hit at his own throat. His continuing to fight off and scream as staff got in. I couldn't imagine such crushing, desperate depression. Story 23. So I have worked at a forensic state hospital for most of my adult life now, and there is one story that sticks out and haunts me to this day. HIPAA protects the confidentiality of our patient, so I'll leave out name, but the story could help people understand mental illness and those who suffer from it. I worked with one older gentleman who, for the first couple months I knew him, always looked terrified. He was probably about 5 feet 6 inches and was very thin. He would come out for meals and some easy classes, but always seemed very afraid and unaware of what was going on around him. My job was psychosocial rehab, which translated to teaching people how to live as independently as possible and also trying to promote quality of life. After working with our patient for months, me and my coworker were able to coax him out. He would play sports, dominoes, and listen to music. He loved to sing, especially 70s and 80s pop. He was a huge fan of Michael Jackson. We were so happy because we felt like we had helped to pull this man from isolation to having relationships and having some degree of happiness in his life. He had been in this state of terror for years before we worked with him. Rapidly, things took a turn for the worse. He started to detach more and more. He would spend his nights pacing the halls, singing at the top of his voice, and irritating the other patients. He then became violent, where he would run after people and try to kick them. He was very difficult to feed and get water, too. I remember seeing him shake, drenched in sweat, and moaning loudly. Meds didn't touch him. I remember one doctor saying he was in a hyperactive catatonic state, but I think they were wrestling for answers as much as the rest of us. Sometimes I'd be able to play music for him, or play dominoes with him to calm him down, but this never lasted. He started becoming more aggressive, kicking holes in walls one time, becoming tangled in cord. For the safety of the other patients, we'd have to ask them to go in their rooms when he got sick. He never kicked me, but I remember him running at me and leaning on me. I felt so bad for him, I tried to comfort him. His sweat soaked my clothes as he moaned. Everyone was at a loss to ease his pain. Eventually, he was transferred to a maximum security forensic state hospital due to the risk he posed to other patients. The day he left, he seemed aware of what was happening. He seemed sad and betrayed. Maybe this was from my own guilt at my inability to help him. He didn't fight. He just looked long and hard at everyone as they gathered his meager belongings and sent him to a harsher place. I will always remember this man, and I hope that somehow he found peace. Story 24. I worked with a child, started when she was 10, who was the result of a schizophrenic male and a mentally retarded female. The girl had fetal alcohol syndrome, autism, and had scars from being burned with cigarettes. Story 25. I worked as a shopkeep in a mental community. The idea is that psychiatric patients that either could not or would not be rehabilitated into society would spend their time here. There was this one patient called Mark. Mark was 78. He has spent his entire life in institutions since he was 24-ish. He was a millionaire, and I had their shop balances to prove it. He was driven to insanity after coming into a large amount of money, and he was paranoid about keeping it his. No longer a threat to anyone or himself, he was to spend his days at the community, mainly because he had no idea how the outside world worked and no family or friends to entrust his care. Come one Christmas, he came to my shop and said, "I am embarrassed, Mr. Jarl, because I never learned to write properly and I really want to send Christmas cards to my friend. Would you help me out?" Being no calligraphist, I reluctantly agreed and spent the good part of 2 hours with him, writing cards to the staff and his friends around the community. Finally, there was one card left. He said, "I want you to write this one to you." I respectfully declined. I didn't need the card, and I believe they are a waste of money. Trees. No, I insist. You have done so much for me. Okay, well, I knew from my training not to agitate the patients. If I could accept a request, I would do it. So I wrote out the card, stuck it in its envelope, and handed it back to Mark. He looked at me, handed me the card with a wry grin, and said, "You just wrote a Christmas card to yourself. You should be in here, not me." He promptly skipped off with all his cards. Told her it was me. I was the most troubled patient I'd worked with. Story 26. Worked in a forensic mental health facility for almost 2 years. And needless to say, there were a lot of people that I'd put on the troubled end of the spectrum. However, the one that was the most troubled easily was the guy we had in a vault 24 hours a day. Like literally, his room door was a vault door. A protected camera high up on the ceiling in the corner of the room. He was 6 feet 5 inches and easily 300 pounds. Allowed a dedicated psychiatric aide keep an eye on him for their whole shift. Yes, this one person's job for 12 hours was to watch him. This guy was allowed outside for 5 minutes a day, though he was rarely stable enough to allow for it. When they did take him outside, he was chained up with a mask and shackles and cuffs, straight up Lecter style, and escorted by 6 people. 6. They'd do a little circle around a walled-in courtyard and take him back. In the time I was there, I never saw him freak out. Apparently, he had calmed down quite a bit thanks to -33 ECT sessions and an insane dosage of meds they injected into him regularly. That being said, his normal state was nothing to envy. He'd spend his days eating his own crap, fisting himself, drawing art with vomit, eating his own vomit, pleasure himself, and wiping the results. Across the window whenever a female nurse or aide walked past his tiny peephole of a window, and laughing, talking to himself or the wall. I never found out what he did to end up in the facility in the first place. A lot of our residents had done their crimes before the 90s, so not a lot of their info was readily available online. One of the guys who had worked there since the early 80s told me he never remembered why the guy was initially brought it, but that he had been moved to the highest security room after raping a few other residents and assaulting some staff with a weapon. Story 27. I met him when he was 11 years old. He was a scary child. He didn't look at you. He looked through you with these cold, dead eyes. He rarely spoke to anyone except his therapists. If you asked him to do something, he would quietly get up and do it. The scariest times with him was when he would explode. He would have these intermittent explosions of anger that were so severe that the only way to keep everyone, including him, safe was to dose him with a heavy sedative and let him sleep it off. I worked with a lot of kids at that place, but Aaron still haunts me to this day. That poor child endured terrors I suspect few could survive. I asked one of his psychiatrists if he could ever live a normal life, and he told me that sadly, he never would. He said Aaron will probably spend the rest of his life in an institution. The abuse was just so severe that it caused literal biological changes to his brain that could never be fixed, and the emotional and mental damage done was beyond fixing, since it all happened at a time when a child is developing mental traits that drive the way they interact with people for the duration of their lives. Basically, the damage done to him was so severe that he'll never be able to function in regular society. Story 28. A young man with a history of poorly managed schizophrenia who also had chronic meth-induced psychosis, or what I heard someone call methaphrenia. Within 10 seconds of meeting me, he had called me, or whoever he thought he was talking to, an escort. He threatened to hit me if I made eye contact with him. He said his deceased father was going to help him. He had done so much damage with his years of met use, on top of his poorly controlled schizophrenia, that he was incapable of any sort of meaningful interaction with another human being. He couldn't comprehend a single subject or idea for more than a couple seconds, and it was like he lived in this chaotic world that none of us had access to. He could become physically aggressive at the drop of a hat for no perceived reason, or he could sit in a corner, crying and yelling that he was a good boy, and he didn't need any of this. Even the most seasoned staff members wouldn't enter a room alone with him. He was a court-appointed commitment, as he was far too dangerous to walk the streets and too far gone to take part in any sort of rehab or social program. He was in his early 30s, and it's likely he'll be in institutions for the rest of his life, partly because of years of bad decisions and partly because of the hand he was dealt. There was this story that I read a long time ago about a whale that lived in the ocean somewhere, who was born with an inability to make sounds at the frequency that any other whale could understand. This whale just swam around, calling out to others in a way that no one could understand or respond to, alone forever. I always thought of that whale when I worked with this patient. It preserved my patience and empathy for him when he was displaying more negative or aggressive behaviors. That was seriously what it seemed his life was like. He could speak, but nothing made sense. He could hear you, but he wouldn't respond in any meaningful way. It gives me hope that even after death threats and shows of force, as far gone as he seemed, there were still so many people still trying to help him and find a way to communicate with him. Staff in psych wards, institutions get a bad rap, but honestly, they wouldn't put up with the kind of stuff they have to for the amount that they get paid if they didn't feel a calling to be there, and none of them had given up on him. Hopefully someday, they'll find a way to break through or bring him out. Story 29. Not specifically at a psychiatric ward, but had a patient at the hospital with severe dementia. I had gotten her up and out of the bed to the bedside commode, bedside toilet, and while trying to get her back in bed, she demanded I get my hands off of her. She took a step back away from me, ripped off her gown, and was completely naked, grabbed the commode and started attempting to swing it at me, while accusing me of making slurs towards her. I had to end up calling the charge nurse, who proceeded to call security. Well, about a minute later, security comes running in the room and busts out laughing as he sees a butt-naked little old lady trying to corner me while swinging a commode at me. Story 30. In nursing school, I had a clinical rotation for 6 weeks in a mental health facility. I worked on an acute floor where patients would come in and get treated and leave a few days or weeks later. 2 patients stick out in my mind. One of them, I would talk with her and play cards with her, and from talking with her, you really could not tell that anything was wrong with her, except at times she would be delusional in thinking her ex-husband had been abusive to her as well as her father, was coming to take her home, and they were going to go live in Mexico in secret. Now the ex wanted nothing to do with her and had no contact with her. The other patient was 6 months pregnant, and I was talking to her, and one day I was talking with her, and she said sometimes the voices in her head told her she wasn't pregnant. So I asked her what the voices were saying that day, and she said they said, "Go outside for a smoke and have a good day." The next day I was talking with her again, and she was agitated and standoffish. I asked her what the voices were saying, and she said, "They are saying bad, terrible things, and she can't tell me." I noped out of the room fast and told the actual staff. For a few weeks, I was on the continuing care floor, which had patients who had been there a long time. There was one huge guy who I played cards with one day, and I asked him about what his interests were and stuff, and he told me he was a musician and had 3 brothers, and they played on the radio all the time. Finally, he had written 77 songs, 77 books, 77 stories, and a few more things. He had not done any of that. Story 31. I was in a psychiatric intensive care unit for a night. They didn't have enough rooms, so I got a roommate, a man in his 50s. I see him hovering over me while I'm trying to sleep, muttering that the room is filling with water. Next, I hear something about elves. Then he accuses me of being in league with the elves, and he attempts to attack. I leapt out of bed and took off running with this crazy old dude chasing me. Then I discovered the hard way the PQ has locked doors to prevent escapes. Story 32. A patient stormed off. He didn't like what his therapist was telling him, and it pissed him off to hell. He went in the lobby and wrecked it. Coffee cups crushed and thrown everywhere. Water thrown all on the floor and couches. Paintings and portraits had holes punched into them, not the face. Couch cushions were thrown and bitten. Walls were punched. Then, at last, the grand finale. He made his way on top of the table, made a squat, pulled his ass out of his pants, and took a straight-up crap on the table. Worst tantrum ever. Not even the janitor wanted to deal with his mess. Story 33. I spent some time in wards. I think the worst was when I was 14. A 3 or 4-year-old girl was brought in. She wouldn't stop crying and trying to pull her hair out. So the staff put her in the quiet room and then spent ages yelling at her to stop crying and stop pulling her hair out, and yelled at her for wetting herself. I couldn't sleep, so I offered to try to calm her down, and they let me. I let her sit on my lap, and after that, she started calming down and went to sleep. She wasn't really the most troubled, but her age made the situation the most upsetting. I think she was just really scared. I left her in the quiet room with staff. I don't know if they put her in bed or what. They let me take a shower and let me sleep in. She was only there because DHs had to pull her out of her home in the middle of the night and didn't have any place to take her. She was picked up before I got up the next morning to be taken to a foster home. I guess the most troubled person was a lady with psychosis. She was walking around spitting on the floor so that her spit could poison the nurses. She told me to be careful, so I didn't get poisoned too. That was the only relatively coherent thing I heard her say. I actually have more horror stories about the staff than I do the other patients. Most of the patients were just kind of sad and needed help. Story 34. A former patient here. This got long sorry. A girl who wasn't in my unit but ate meals at the same time as my unit had early onset Alzheimer's and schizophrenia. Aaron told me that she apparently had a genius IQ level before the schizophrenia and Alzheimer's set in. She took to me instantly on my first day and would sit next to me during meals, babbling away in a language that sounded like a mix of Albed, a fictional language from Final Fantasy X, and Sindrin, J.R.R. Tolkien's Elvish. I think she was a nerd like myself. She got really excited at my tattoos when we first met, which is why she sat next to me. I have a Triforce on my left hand and a Sailor Moon-inspired tat on my upper left arm, and she loved to just look at them. If I wore a long-sleeved shirt, she'd gently tug at my left sleeve so she could look at the semtat. She would give each tattoo like 3 minutes of intense staring before moving on. Occasionally, she would call me Lena, which isn't my real name, but oddly enough is an online name of mine in a few different places. That was uncanny, and I wondered if we had been online friends at some point. But whenever I asked, she would just shrug. I'll never forget my last meal with her. I didn't know I was being discharged that day, which the reasons why are a long story, but somehow she knew. She said something which further gave me evidence that she was speaking a mix of Albede and Elven. She said, "Imuja we, Lena." We, the rest I didn't understand, can't remember Dueth. Dueth I know is Sindarin for darkness. Imuja we is I love you in Albede. I asked my psychologist, who had been assigned to me during my stay the other day, about her. Apparently she lost a baby a few years before being admitted to the clinic. Her daughter's name was to be Lena. The psychologist shouldn't have told me this, HIPAA and all that. But she only did. So after I spoke to her in length about my interactions with this patient, I just hope my being there for a week helped brighten her life just a little bit. Story 35. I worked for a while as part of a group that would do emergency room consultations for a large urban hospital system. When a patient with a psych or substance abuse issue came in, the ER staff would call us and we'd drive out and give recommendations. I saw lots of wild crap. A menstruating woman who was jumping on the couches Tom Cruise style. A dude that lost his junk. Somebody pleasure himself under the blanket during an assessment while an airplane flew into the Pentagon on TV. People who told me I was a git more times than I can count. One night, I got called out to one of the more suburbaners for a gentleman who had come in with some gastrointestinal complaints. The staff reported that his story was odd and that they'd just like someone to check it out. The guy was middle-aged, clean, and very neatly dressed in business attire. He asked me if I had ever heard of Barrett's esophagus, when cells in the lining of the esophagus are damaged by exposure to acid from the stomach. I told him that yes, I had heard of the condition, and he responded, "Well, I have Barrett's stomach." He reported that a famous GI specialist diagnosed him with this, and the only cure was to lose 40 pounds. By this point, I was thinking, yeah, delusional, relatively harmless, not death, okay to discharge to outpatient mental health, good night. Story 36. I worked for a number of years, a residential facility, ages 6 to 106, and have seen it all. Most clients were diagnosed autism, so you saw the typical self-injury and harmful to others. Most older clients had a mild to moderate disability that today you would just accept as slow. But since they had been there for so long, the facility was their home, and they didn't want to go elsewhere. It's also really nice, I might add. But I saw some crap. First, had a client shove a metal jagged end of a broomstick that he snapped in half right into his abdomen, then start screaming and digging into it with his fingers. 2 had a child, maybe 8 years, who could have modeled on the front of a Gap catalog. He could be the nicest, quietest kid, or he could try and hit you with whatever was nearby. It was in his file. 3, another kid, completed his whole program and set to go home. We were all thrilled. He came back the following week because he stripped naked in school and threw a desk at his classmate. 4th, another child, maybe 6, severely burned by a family member. 5, had a teenage client end his life in a horrific manner. 6, had an adult client go outside with a bat and smash a coworker's new BMW. I was actually thrilled to see that happen. Maybe the most troubled were some of the staff, rather than the clients. You had staff who had been there for decades and truly cared about the clients. Then, you had new hires that wouldn't last more than a year. And although I never saw anything physically abusive, I definitely had to report staff being verbally abusive to clients. Story 37. I worked overnights at an adult group home that had absorbed spillover from a state hospital. There was a bedtime, but most clients were up and down throughout the night, those not heavily sedated. 2 staff would sit on the back porch area, while our clients would smoke cigarettes or just sit around and talk. Staff always parked around back, so when I arrived each night at midnight, I would usually see several of my clients as I was walking in. I was warned by staff not to do the following: wear my seatbelt while parking, not chew cinnamon-flavored gum, and not to wear a lot of red, just ever. So, one of the most interesting patients I worked with, we will call him Cat Guy. Upon meeting Cat Guy for the first time as I walked in, he asked if I had wore my seatbelt on the way to work. As innocent of a question as it may sound, I later found out it was a stimulus for arousal. The mere mention of seatbelts, and if they had went across your lap, etc., etc. He was never profane in language regarding the seatbelt placement, but his facial expression said enough. Same goes for the smell of cinnamon and ladies wearing red, like turning on a light switch. So, there was also a fascination with cats. Not live, breathing cats, luckily, but fictional and stuffed animal cats. We actually had a few stray cats around the building. He never even showed interest, but when getting him into bed, the bed lined with stuffed cats beside a wall full of cat posters and coloring sheets. We would have to monitor behaviors between him and the cats, and cartoon movies of cats. There were also signs of objectophilia. He would give intricate details and dedication to structures that he loved studying and drawing. But it was conversation you would have about a loved one. Story 38. Didn't work, but spent some time as a patient at a short-term ward. What struck me the most was this 40-year-old woman who had a daughter, but spent most of her time in and out of the hospital because she acted and functioned with the maturity of a preteen. She and a few others were dependent on their families, but that dependency was so high that it seemed unlikely they'd be able to fully recover and ever become an autonomous adult. What? really shocked me was when a kid I'd met 6 months ago in a drop-in group therapy session appeared as admitted. He was one of those peoples that drew a room to him, and I was overcome with the will to become his friend, as he told his story of how he was trying to figure out what his recent mental illness episode meant and how to navigate it. However, the man I saw at the ward was just a shell of who I had met. He sat to himself most of the time with this blank stare. If I inquired too much about what happened, he would get frustrated and shut down. Eventually, I found out he'd spent some time camping outside his house in a teepee in abject weather because he felt that that was the right thing to do. The most disheartening are the people who would recover if they were just treated as adults by the attendants. After holding a talk of sorts with a few patients about how music helped me get through my troubles, one of the patients who was silent and blank-faced broke down crying. The next day, she was smiling and dancing. For another woman, it seemed like an epiphany when I exclaimed that none of us in the ward are crazy. We're just going through a crisis. Story 39. Was a nursing student at the time, and I have been a nurse for years now, and this is still by far the most troubled patient I have worked with. I was going through my weekly rotation in the psych ward when my instructor assigned me, one of the few males that were admitted. I am a male, so I often got the male patient. Turned out that this is still, to this day, I believe, the only psi patient that have ever been flown into our facility. He would mutilate himself for pleasure. The kicker is, this isn't the first time he has been hospitalized for this. When I asked him why he did it all, he gave me the most sane and logical responses. He said he knows it is wrong. He knows he might be one of the only people in the world that has this issue. He said that since he is so isolated and there is no other way for him to get gratification, he has to mutilate himself. I honestly felt horrible for him because he said he has been struggling with this since he was a kid. As far as I could tell, he was 100% normal, except for the whole mutilation thing. Story 40. I don't work at a psychiatric ward, but I've been there as a patient 2 times. I have MCDD, which is a form of autism that makes it really hard to control my emotions and thoughts. It's not that bad most of the time. My friends don't even notice if I don't tell them, but I've had some issues in the past. I remember the first time I ever had to go to a psychiatric clinic. I was 16 at the time, and I was scared crapless and really didn't want to go. Took me some time to get used to it, but I made some friendship that lasted for a really long time. At first, there wasn't really anything to it. Had my own room, living room, and toilets down the hall, and took my PC from home, so I could play games in my spare time. Made some friends which I could just smoke with and have fun. Overall, not that bad. Wasn't until about 1 month that crap went down. There was this kid 2 rooms next to mine. 15-year-old emo kid that didn't really act depressed or anything, just wore a lot of black and spikes and crap. Apparently he got a lapse of self-control and hit his entire body. That was also the time where I totally lost my crap, and I found myself in a downward spiral. I just couldn't believe that someone could do that to himself, and that out of a lapse of self-control, turned out afterwards that his father was really mentally abusive towards him, and he claimed to hit himself so he could relieve the pain from his head. Luckily, he's doing all right now as far as I know. Don't really talk to him much, but I see posts on Facebook about him going to a concert or skateboarding. So, I'll guess he's all right. Story 41. I currently work in a state hospital, and my primary unit is a forensics unit. So I see many patients that have charges. The one patient that I would say was troubled was a man in his mid-30s we had a few months back. I don't remember what his charges were, to be honest, but it was rather minor, probably criminal trespass or a minor assault charge. But he would sleep in the lobby most nights, and if he woke up at all, he'd sit there and cry for hours. We were told to ignore it as he did it all the time, which rubbed me the wrong way. Finally, one morning I was on an overtime shift and he had woken up and having a good day till just after MedPass, when he started crying loudly and for no apparent reason. I decided to go sit and talk with him. Turns out he was depressed, something not on his diagnosis, because he was afraid of what comes next. No one had told him that there is halfway homes or programs to help patients get back to a normal life, after they either got their charges dropped, which his was a few days later, or after they served their time in jail. He thanked me profusely and made rapid improvement in his depression after that. Last I heard from the caseworkers, he was placed in a halfway house with a good work program and was making good headway. Story 42. I worked on an inpatient psychiatric unit that was for adults deemed to be a threat to themselves or others. One young woman was experiencing a severe delusion that included her family she lived with and her surrounding neighbors. She believed they were talking about her behind her back constantly, saying that she smelled horrible, she was disgusting, and that she didn't deserve to live. This woman had a history of self-harming behaviors in her teens. I'll never forget her showing me her forearms. The word ugly had been scarred deep into both. Anyway, she was very depressed to the point of wanting to end her life because of how gross she felt. In reality, her family told us that neither they nor their neighbors have ever thought she smelled bad. She in fact kept very clean, which is understandable due to the delusion. Another elderly man didn't talk much, except for whispering incoherently to voices he was hearing. The behavior he most expressed was actually licking surfaces, most of the time the walls and floors, as opposed to other inanimate objects. When he was in the day room, he would just sit up and quickly lick either, then sit back down. Although when he was alone in his room, he exhibited this licking behavior much more. He was found on several occasions licking the walls of his room for longer periods of time. I actually tried to get him to sign a release of information so I could speak to his case manager at the nursing home he came from. As I handed him the clipboard, he bent down and quickly licked the tip of my thumb that held it. He was actually a very sweet man and responded to redirection, but I could not wash and sanitize my hand enough that day. Story 43. Oh man, a few stuck in my mind. One is this guy who lost someone and spent 30 years in a penitentiary, somehow is out but still mentally ill, gets detained and sent to us. He's just ornery about everything and is really labile. Goes from laughing with you to being real pissed. Got so bad after having him for over a month, we had to put him in seclusion. After we got him in, he stood up, looked at us from the window, and pulled out a metal hook thing from the courtyard. Don't know how he got it. And a muffin. We hadn't had muffins for at least 4 days. Another is a kid, barely more than 18, who could barely focus on anything in this world. He liked to talk about time and space and have the most bizarre but interesting conversation. Another is a 6-foot-something huge dude who introduced himself to me as Britney Spears' last one. This dude who would always repeat the word eat, and when you asked him what he's eating, he'd just say it again. He would grind his teeth so loud I could hear him across the room. He was obsessed with Michael Jackson, had a website, online shrine devoted to him, had a YouTube channel where he talked about the craziest crap, and Michael Jackson. Finally, he was obsessed about getting out of there, like most people are. Contacted an attorney, like some do. Unlike most, he used his attorney and his knowledge of the legal system to get out on a technicality. Crazy as hell, but we couldn't keep him. Godspeed good, sir. Story 44. Guy who was usually very sweet but couldn't handle stress, and would have episodes where he would run and smash his forehead against doors, windows until he literally had goose eggs you could put golf balls into. People so paranoid that you could leave a salt shaker on a table near their room, and they would think it was an assassination attempt. Conspiracy to defeat them with psychological warfare. Someone who would spend almost all their time walking in circles screaming at imaginary people. One time I heard him yell, "Fire every missile! Blow up the sky! Blow up the sky!" A middle-aged man who literally had an emotional age of 6 who spent almost all his time annoying staff, throwing literal tantrums or manipulating people to cause fights. A severe schizophrenic who was usually quiet because he spent 99% of his time being haunted by images of dead people he knew and trying to manage that. Story 45. Not one of the more troubled patients I've seen, but definitely makes me tear up thinking about it. I was in my psychiatric nursing rotation a few years back, and we had a clinical session at a short-term youth center, mostly 6 to 14-year-olds in central Georgia. Most of the kids were very rebellious and resistant to authority. We spent a lot of the day on the butt end of meltdowns, threats, etc. It was rough to see the way these kids' home lives and families had affected them. Then, there is this boy, 9 years old, and I have been assigned to be paired with him for the day. He's a little overweight, quiet, but eventually he starts talking to me. I can tell through watch. The way the other kids talk to him, he gets picked on a lot. He tells me some stories about his parents, how he loves video games, and how one day he wants to play football. Him and I made these little origami squares together, and he colored mine orange and blue, because I'm a UF fan. At the end of our time there, he asked if I'd come back to see him, that he really liked having a friend. I read through some of his chart, and he'd been diagnosed with depressive disorder. His parents were addicts. His father used him as a distraction to rob convenience stores in the area. His parents would leave him alone for days at a time. He witnessed his mom end her life when he was 7 years old. After that, his grandparents took him in. It's been 2 years since I met him, and I think of him a lot. I wish I'd had more power to help him at the time. Story 46. 10 years ago, I worked for a secure mental health unit. So, as not to prejudice the residents, you weren't allowed to read their personal files. So I did a few months. No issues, apart from a guy saying, he wanted my heart. To be honest, I had worked with much worse. Anyway, once I got to read the files, I learned. The charming guy that always offered to make me cups of tea and shared sweets with me was a pedo. The saddest case was one guy who genuinely was nice, but could become violent due to confusion. He was confused because when he was younger, a woman had split up with him. He wanted to end his life, but someone found him and got him down. Unfortunately, he had been technically dead for a while, and his brain was permanently damaged, and he had the memory of a couple of minutes. There were all sorts of stories I could tell, much like in prison. There was one guy who we often had to turf out of other residents' rooms as he would go in and trade BJ for food. The staff were overworked, underpaid and underappreciated, and it was a tough job. The shifts were 12 hours long sometime, and due to short staffing, you could end up there for days. Story 47. Another woman comes to mind that I worked with for a few years before her passing. I was in my early 20s when I met a woman that we'll call Edith. She was in her late 60s, somewhat feeble but very troubled. The first time I met her, she asked me, "The duck you looking at?" Don't stare at me, because they will tell me why you're staring at me. I couldn't respond and kept walking. This old woman started shrieking at the top of her lungs and finally yelled out, "They're hurting me! Oh, they're hurting me! Why do they do this to me?" I turned around and came rushing back to see what was wrong. Edith was sitting at a bench, leaned over with her head in her hand. I asked her, "Edith, are you okay? Is there anything I can do to help?" She looked up at me with watery eyes and quietly asked, "Do you know why they hurt me? They abuse me and kick me and spit at me." I noticed my own eyes watering. I knew this woman heard voices. I knew the voices were tormenting her, and there was nothing I could do to help her. As my heart grew heavier, she suddenly started screaming again. "Stop hurting me! Stop hurting me! Stop hurting me!" Just over and over and over again. She died from natural causes about 3 years later. It is so terrible to say, but I didn't cry and couldn't cry, and still will not cry for her death. She lived in absolute misery day in and day out. Death, I honestly believe, was better for her. At least she doesn't think anyone is hurting her anymore. Story 48. When I was doing psych clerkship as a med student, there was a schizophrenic patient with the usual signs: auditory hallucinations, disheveled appearance, no expression on his face. He admitted to voices talking to him. The resident I was shadowing asked him what the voices say to him, and he refused to answer that question. Then she informed him that they can give him some medications to make the voices go away, and he immediately rebuked that option. Mind you, still displaying no expression on his face the whole time. When the resident asked him why, Zrenya, he replied, "They are my only friends." That hit hard. Story 49. I don't have much experience in the psych ward, and in my few weeks there during my nursing clinical, I probably didn't encounter any patients as extreme as those described in all the other posts in this thread. I did, however, see how devastatingly and quickly a mental illness can take over someone's life. The best example of this was a patient who I'll call TIT, was a successful widow, a mother of a cute 3-year-old and making 6 figures as a pharmaceutical rep. She had several close friends, great connections with her family, and no history of any medical or mental illness. One day, she came home from work, and babysitter still present, tried to beat her son. Millions of diagnostic tests later, doctors have no idea what caused her homicidal behavior. Commonly crazy out of the blue behavior, like that is caused by a brain bleed or other sudden neurological issue. She had already been in the psych ward for 2 months when I first worked with her. She doesn't speak. She only paces around the unit and stares at people. They've tried dozens of different psychiatric substances, and she is now halfway through her etc. treatment with no changes in her catatonic behavior. She was the worst I've seen, mainly because every health professional at the hospital was in agreement that she won't be getting better and never will be able to return to a normal life with her son and family. Story 50. I volunteered at a youth facility in college, and one kid was in a rough place. He had pretty severe Tourette's, some kind of mild schizophrenia, depression, and a host of other things too. He would go from being your best friend to blaming you for the death of a non-existent family member in seconds. So yeah, he was in a rough place. On a lighter note, I did get to witness the greatest game of Monopoly. Ever played that involved that kid and another troubled little dude? They played with one of those electronic banks that keeps track of money for you. Each of them had several green army men on the board. One rolled a dice to move, the other drew Uno cards. Sometimes they decided that the other player had to skip their turn. Nothing to do with the Uno card that was drawn, I asked. Other times, they would both go at once, and whoever moved the other player's piece first got to keep it for themselves. When they landed on a space, whether it was owned or not, they would call out a number, and that was the amount that was owed. It started low, but was in the millions within a few minutes. There were also chocolate gold coins and Jolly Ranchers involved in some way, but I could never figure out how they decided when to trade candy or who owed who how much. I don't think there was a winner to this game, but man, was it entertaining to watch? Story 51. There was one guy I remember. Normally, I work on an open ward. Sometimes the closed wards call for help, or when they push the alarm, we have to run. More than 50 times in 2 weeks, I was there just for this guy. Mid-30. He had absolutely no control of what he was doing. Every time I've been there, he said weird stuff like the butler flies fly high to the light when they're in hell. Most of the time, he was naked and started to pleasure himself in front of us. He started to remember me after the 20th time I've been there. Sometimes there was a glimpse of how he had been before he got sick. I talked to him for 1 or 2 minutes, and he was totally focused on me, answering me like a normal human being. I've even managed to calm him down a few times, because nothing seemed to cure this poor man. He started to take the last medication possible called clozapine. He actually seemed to get better. He even changed to my ward for a few days, but it just was too much freedom for him. One day he gets a vacation from the closed ward. He seemed to be mentally strong to go out because he had 1 to 3 hour vacations that went well. But these kind of mental illness gets back to you when you least expect it. He jumped off a bridge and passed. I think I will always remember him. Story 52. I work at a psychiatric and behavioral institution that houses both adults and children. On the adult side, we had a patient that has walking around naked and bothering the other patient. The nurses decided they needed a parin, which is essentially a sedative. I walked into her room with the Fran, who we'll call John for privacy. She was wrapped in a blanket sitting on her bed, and John told her we were going to give her a shot to help her calm down. She said, "First, you must tell me your name." John says, "Well, I'm John. Now let me see your shoulder for this shot." She replies, "I know John, and he's dead." John looks at himself and says, "Well, I feel fine, but we're going to do this shot now." At this point, she flings off the blanket and runs towards the door. Oh, and once I had to sit with the cameras while a dude whacked it for 2 hours. Story 53. 16-hour-old post. So this will probably be buried, but I'll share anyway. The hospital I worked at over the summer had an inpatient mental health ward. It was bleak there, to say the least. 2 hallways, 1 TV, no rec space. You could only go outside if you were voluntary or had a day pass. There was one kid who had been there for nearly 6 months at that point. No older than me, I don't think. He couldn't have been more than 22 or 23 years old. He was severely autistic and had problems with personal space. He would hit you if you got too close, and not a little love tap, a full-on closed fist punch. He's injured other patients, nurses, and security multiple times. When it's time for lights out, it takes him up to 3 hours to just put on pajamas and brush his teeth. He was doing better towards the end of the summer, but then he hit a guard and a nurse over a weekend. I felt bad for him because his doctor considered giving him a day pass because his behavior had improved. But then that happened, and they pretty much just said, forget it. I'm at a new hospital now, but I have no doubts he's still there. It's unfortunate, but he'll likely spend his life in psychiatric wards. Working with mental health patients has given me so much perspective on the issues we face as a society tasked with the care of these individuals. We've come so far, but we still have a long way to go. Story 54. A buddy of mine was a nurse in a state mental hospital. They had a dude who was very fond of making crap footballs. Staff would walk into his room again and again, and there would be a football fashioned out of a crap just sitting in the middle of his bed. Story 55. One time had a Navy SEAL on the unit just diagnosed as psychotic. He decided to leave, and we watched him kick his way through a locked metal door, something that we thought was physically impossible. He kicked and kicked until it bent enough to pull the latches free. As it was an involuntary court-ordered hospitalization, we were supposed to stop him. But when we saw what he was doing to the door, we decided maybe we would just let him go, as if we could have stopped him, called the police, and let them deal with it. Heard later he was found limping. Door took a toll. Down a street in just his underwear, rambling about the enemy. Word was it took about 10 cops to subdue him, using all their non-lethal weapons. Story 56. When I was on my psych rotation, we had this one guy that was admitted for extremely aggressive behavior. He had been caught numerous times trying to break into his mom's house and steal things to sell. And I have no idea how he ended up in our long-term care facility. It may have been death ideation. He was definitely a sociopathic and narcissistic individual. When he didn't get his way, he basically would go around ripping signs and things off the wall, yell at staff and patients, punch techs in the face, and so on. His last day before discharge, he was threatening to come back to the site and hit the staff as they left for the day. Retribution for not giving him triple meals. They arranged for him to be put into a halfway house far from the place, had a full police escort drive and drop him off. The next day I was at the main hospital for a conference, and I saw him in handcuffs in the basement hallways, being escorted to the police office. He looked at me, recognized me, and was going, "Hey dude!" acting as if I was going to bail him out. I ignored him, lifted my meal a little higher to hide my name on my ID badge, and kept walking. Those are the kinds of people that you really have to watch out for when leaving the hospital. Story 57. 11-year-old girl came in with the police. Her brother changed the TV channel. She was eating her dinner and hit him 4 times in the arm, then jumped from the first story. 9 security officers and 2 police officers to restrain her. She was chewing her gums and doing an assessment. Pond decided it was behavioral after 5 minutes and sent her back to juvenile prison. Story 58. This is my brother's story. He was in his clinical psych rotation. Randy the Dragon, not his real name, was a man in his mid-40s that was super nice and sweet. He walked around like a T-Rex and had made wings out of a hospital gown, like a cape cut in half. He would walk around talking nicely to everyone. But you had to be careful because if Randy didn't like you for some reason, he would breathe fire on you, which was just Randy hissing at you. If you played along, that was all well and good. But if you laughed at him and let your guard down or ignored him, he might bite you, and I mean go after you the same way a dragon would, and would need to be restrained and sedated and put in restraints. It sounds pretty harmless, minus the biting. But Randy was completely delusional and schizophrenic, and he was danger to himself and others. So he will most likely be institutionalized the rest of his life. One of the nurses told him that Randy had been in there since he was 20 years old. So he had already been in there most of his adult life. Story 59. Didn't work there, but visited a psych ward on a field trip when I was 11. It was kind of a hangout session with the less troubled residents with a 6th grade class. Obviously, we didn't meet the people that were the worst off in the ward. Our teacher, who set it up, told us about all of the people we were going to meet. She especially mentioned this one man who would compulsively harm himself. She told us about him so no one would freak out when they saw him and his resulting disfigurements. He was incredibly kind to us when we were doing arts and crafts, seemed like a normal person despite his appearance, which is alarming when you're 11 years old. He was a gentle soul, but required constant supervision to prevent further self-harm. I definitely came out of the experience having a different perspective on mental illnesses, and I will never forget that school trip. Story 60. Okay, story time. Second week at a child psychiatric ward as a summer job. First job in psych. Girl decides she has too much intact skin and hit. No big deal. We let things cool down a bit and drive down to the surgery ward to have a nice doctor put some stitches in. So far, so good. On the way back, I'm left to keep an eye on her while the other guy working goes to get the car. It's just her and me. She tries to jump in front of a slow-moving car, and I body block her. I'm thinking, please don't start running into traffic. But of course that's her plan. When the driver comes around the corner and starts slowing down, she bolts. I take off after her, and the driver gets out of the car and starts running too. Before she reaches any traffic, we catch up to her and grab her. So here we have two grown men grappling with a teen girl and trying to get her into a black car. She screams a lot for help. We got looks, but luckily people spotted our hospital ID tags and let us forcefully get her into the car. I felt like a kidnapper for a long while after. Story 61. I worked in a forensic psychiatric ward. One patient that stood out was a middle-aged man with paranoid schizophrenia. He got into the hospital because he hacked an elderly couple to death with an axe. He was as sweet as can be when on meds that worked, but they only lasted so long. When the meds weren't working, he would sit on the floor with his head down, angrily talking to his voices. He suffered from very violent command hallucinations that told him to hit people. I once heard him murmuring, "No, I ain't gonna hit me. She is a nice lady." And then he looked up at me with the most evil eye. I tried talking to him soothingly and saying, "Don't listen to that violence and take a deep breath." But then I exited and requested sedation. I still feel bad for him and his victims. He really was so gentle when the meds worked. Another patient of mine lit her own house on fire with her 4 kids in it. They survived due to command hallucination. Incredibly sweet and creative woman while on meds. Please note, the vast majority of people with schizophrenia are not violent. Even those with hallucination. Command hallucinations are typically not violent, but are a greater risk factor. If you have a loved one with psychosis, get them treatment. Story 62. I worked primarily on a peds psych unit when I first started working in Me Talk Health. But given that it was a research hospital, I was required to float around to different units to make sure I was competent to work with multiple populations. When I first started working in psych, I had one patient who came to us from residential for a med adjustment. At the point where he was taken from his father's custody, he had been locked in a closet for a few years. The only times he was allowed out was during his father's weekly poker game, where the winner was allowed to take him into a back room and do whatever they wanted. Whenever the kid was triggered, he would throw himself to the floor and repeatedly start slamming his head on the ground. I saw him a few years later on one of the adult floors. Not much had changed. There were a bunch of other terrible stories I heard during my time there, but this was the only patient I got to see years later. Story 63. I worked in mental health lockdown in the local jail. Inmates at risk of hurting themselves or others were crowded into cells to be on died watch. One individual was severely schizophrenic and had to be housed alone because he was always doing some kind of attention-seeking gesture like yelling, running around manically in his little cell, doing naked yoga, peeing under his door, etc. He only ever came out of his cell to go to rec briefly or to shower and brush teeth 3 times a week. And even then, it was accompanied by several guards because of his instability. He had been there for months by the time I got there. One day, the chaplain got a call that the man's mother was dying and wanted to talk to him. He couldn't understand this and refused to call her, continuously saying, "I'll talk to her tomorrow." They tried to call the psychiatrist in to do an emergency medication order to make him lucid enough to make the phone call. The psychiatrist decided medication wasn't indicated, and he would prefer to skip work to go golfing. out of all the really ill people I saw, and even the death row inmates. That got to me the most. Story 64. 8 years, 4 in a fell crisis unit, 4 in a Virginia State Hospital. Hands down scariest mofo I've ever met was the guy who told me the, "If there's grass on the field, it's time to play ball" joke. I've been hospitalized by other patients. The term sociopath is not one to be tossed around lightly. Story 65. My first job out of nursing school was at a state hospital. I have so many stories, but I think the one that was the most troubled was the patient who was going to be a lifer in the maximum security hospital. He was a true sociopath. He was put in for being a hitman for a gang. He was found NGRI, medicated, rehabbed, and sent to the regular hospital, eventually earning weekend passes for good behavior. Let me add that he was 2.5 hours from his hometown. He was picked up after a year in his hometown after he lost a guy. Come to find out that he arranged with his gang to leave a car in the parking lot, and he would drive to his hometown every weekend. He ended up lost 70-plus people in all. The judge said he couldn't leave our lockdown facility even if it burned down around him. We were so short-staffed that only one person could move between the units. I would go to each unit and chart. I worked nights. He would sit in the day room staring at me a lot. He was the only person I was truly afraid would hurt me. Story 66. I'm a mental health student nurse. There's lots. I think dementia and schizophrenia are the worst because of the hallucination. They truly believe people are out to get them and are genuinely scared. Imagine living your life thinking people are trying to hit you, nurses are trying to poison you with meds, your family are plotting against you. It must be hell. Story 67. When I was a patient at the local hospital, there was this really big guy who had 2 personalities. You never knew which version of him you're currently speaking to. What makes it really sad is that his parents visited him very often, and sometimes he didn't recognize them. He would start crying and beg the nurse to get rid of the strangers bothering him. His mother always looked completely crushed when she left. I always felt bad for her. Story 68. I didn't work in the ward. I was in the ward for a psychotic break. Interestingly enough, I was a pretty normal patient, but the girl I'm thinking of was clearly not okay. She had, or thought she had, MPD, and a whole host of other nightmarish things. She'd scream and whip herself about and talk in the voices of the other people inside her head, but she wasn't all bad. She escaped her room one night and was hiding in her hallway. She had her own area because she was pretty dangerous, and I got bored and left my room and found her. For those of you who wouldn't believe that I left my room, I did. I was supposed to have a minder at all times, except I was really good, like didn't scream or cry or anything. So when this girl left her room, everyone, including my minder, left to go find her. So I spent nearly a half hour just talking her down, getting her to relax and uncurl herself from a ball. I don't know what ended up happening to her. I don't think she's all right, though. Story 69. I was a nursing student in 2016, and we all take a semester with mental health. There was a young patient there that had trouble with schizophrenia. The more serious complication came in when I learned that he was from a fairly religious family that tried to discipline him for acting out until he was 18. Then, they just let him out on his own. He didn't do so well without a support network and wound up homeless, and he was now being held against his will under monitoring for death ideation. What makes it the most troubling? Without any support or health insurance, we could only refer him to free clinics for non-emergency care, many of which in the area have strong religious undertones. Think 12-step programs. This religious association would make him reject the help on the spot, and he would try to find anything else. I later found out he was able to find an open space with a secular clinic, but he had to work so hard just to find the spot. I'm concerned that for the particular area I was in, he might fall into a gap in the care system. Story 70. I worked as a tech in the intake office at a psych hospital. The places was such a shot show. One guy kept coming back month after month. He would say he was schizophrenic and want to pass. Then, he would leave to go somewhere else back into the wild. 2 weeks after he left, our CEO called us all into the cafeteria of the hospital. She told us that guy had lost his GF. Story 71. I was a teen in my first psych hospital when I met another girl a few years older than me. Her arms were littered with scars from burning herself with cigarettes and self-inflicted wounds that made my own look like child's play. Even though I also required stitches, hers were that much worse. I remember talking to her about her life, school, everything, and she seemed so normal, much like I did, I guess. I found out later on that the reason she was there for a year by the time I arrived was because she had attempted to jump down the staircase and pass, no less than 3 times. She was caught by staff each time before jumping, but that helped to make sense of why she constantly needed her own staff member with her. She also had a habit of taking the plastic forks or spoons, sneaking them to her room, and doing her best to hit herself with plastic. I don't know what happened to her. She was still there when I left, and had no idea when she might be leaving. I hope she's okay now. Story 72. I worked as an RN in an inpatient psych unit. We admitted any age, youngest was 2, and would have some violent individuals with minimal staffing. My worst was a 4-year-old with extensive abuse. Social services found her tied to a tree. She did not meet any typical milestones and would grunt to communicate. I left 3 times during the admission process to choke back tears. It was the beginning of the end for my career working in psych. I had the thickest skin and could tolerate the toughest of situations. I couldn't take how an individual could corrupt something so innocent. Story 73. Disclaimer. Not me, but a coworker's wife. She works as a therapist at a psychiatric facility in the middle of nowhere. She had a patient transferred to her after he became too attached to his previous worker. The guy had schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and a long history of abuse. Before he was ever admitted, he lived with his mother and sister. His sister had Down syndrome, and his mother was their caregiver. Story 74. I worked graveyard shift at a psych stabilization unit. This is where everyone goes when they first arrive until they are evaluated, and where the craziest people tend to stay. It's easy to work this ward for a week and come away with stories. I've seen 600-pound women scream and moan like at a funeral, whipping off their clothes because we, the psych techs, stole her baby. I've seen little old ladies throw cups of pee at people because they needed to taste her sickness. However, the person that still chills me was this scruffy neat of a young adult, long beard and hair. Looks like the kind of guy you'd see playing Magic the Gathering at any comic book store. He was calm, though, and muttered to himself. One day, he walked up to the nurse's station and pronounced in a clear, conversational tone a phrase I'll never forget. Abuse isn't a crime where I come from because people are stronger. Let that soak in for a minute. Consider the ramifications of someone with that, though walking in the community. Story 75. I worked as a nurse at an adult ward in a corrupt SE country, and I handled a 22-year-old patient who's mentally retarded. His uncle framed him and made everyone believe that he abused someone. Since he's diagnosed with moderate mental retardation, he can't stand to prove himself innocent in court. It hurts, because you feel his innocence and kindness as soon as you talk to him. He has the biggest heart, but no one in his family wants to visit him and take him back because they don't want to bring back mentally retarded abuser. He thinks that doing all the chores and good deeds in the ward will get back to the family, which will make them want him back. The ward hasn't gotten any calls from anyone in the past 4 years. Until this day, it still breaks my heart. Story 76. I was a special education teacher at an institution for foster children who were disabled. It wasn't a psyche ward, but the children lived there. They all had sad stories. I felt like sharing because I think it's relevant. It wasn't a psyche. We had a student, who we will just nickname Jason, who we had to watch closely because he would eat anything in sight. He was also nonverbal, couldn't talk, and profoundly intellectually disabled. Jason was also a gentle, sweet soul. Story 77. When I was in nursing school, we had to do a psych clinic for a couple weeks. I recall one patient who was a young woman in her 20s who had schizophrenia. Most of the staff told us to try not to spend too much time in her room because she would start to get very loud and boisterous, and it was difficult to calm her down. As the day went on, she would come out of her room and would just be talking nonstop. Story 78. I also worked with a guy that was a criminal but very intelligent and didn't act psychotic at all. I have no idea why he was in the psych ward in the first place. However, he stated that he could hit any of us and get away with it because he knew how to play the system. This guy was huge too, probably a good 300 pounds and muscles on muscles to boot. I responded to an alarm when he had grabbed a nurse and punched him so hard in the face he needed reconstructive surgery. In the same time frame after he did that, he grabbed another nurse and hit her face. Both nurses pulled through after spending quite some time in the hospital. This was the only guy I was actually scared of and stated I would lose my job defending myself if I was ever attacked by him. Story 79. I have worked on many mental health wards, but what defines my role is the stories of recovery rather than the troubled stories. Everyone is troubled, whether they have a mental health diagnosis or not. The things you should be talking about is the amazing battles, supportive families, and the strength in people, not the worst self-harm. Story 80. My sister used to work in a nursing home as a CNA. She says the ones with severe dementia were her favorite residents because they were super nice and easy to work with. One of them loved to sing, even though she wasn't all that good at it. One time, my sister had to leave her room after they'd done some sort of sing-along, while sister was getting some work done. And she said something along the lines of, "Okay, I have to go now. How about you think of some more songs that we can sing when I get back?" An hour or so later, sister had forgotten about it and goes back in her room to get something she'd forgotten, and the lady goes like, "Mary had a little lamb," in this screechy old woman voice. Story 81. I've seen the aftermath of a patient who managed to punch his way through a panel of pretty thick security glass and completely hit his hands before he could be restrained. He also drop-kicked a fire door completely off its hinges. The few patients I occasionally interact with are pretty weird around us. because we're contractors. They don't view us as the enemy, like many of them do with NHS staff. I've seen a guy shouting and screaming threats at the nurses surrounding him, waving his arms like crazy, suddenly smile and wave at me, saying, "Morning, mate," then go back to screaming at the nurses like nothing happened. Story 82. Whenever I hear people say, psychiatry is a scam to get you addicted to substances, I can tell they never met some people. Once saw a kid who was like day and night without his meds. On his meds, he had seizures maybe once or twice a day. Off his meds, he would have seizures maybe once or twice an hour. Story 83 wasn't a locked-down psych ward, but a group home for people either on their way out of one or pretty close to being sent to one. Had a guy who was diagnosed ASD, but mom didn't buy it, was homeschooled. The literal worst thing you can do in this situation. So cognitively and emotionally, he was roughly 3 years old. Problem was, he was 6 feet 6 inches, 270 pounds. So when he threw a tantrum, it was a legitimate life or death situation. He didn't last for long before being sent to a locked unit. However, a place wasn't readily available to take him. So we had like a 2-week gap where we were trying to find a placement. Our emergency plan was to evacuate everyone else and have me keep proximity to him until the police arrived. Story 84. I don't work in a psychiatric ward, but I work for the criminal justice system, and we often work with folks who suffer from mental illnesses. One of my favorite clients is on of them. He has a history of mental health issues and substances use. About a year ago, he overdosed. The doctors managed to bring him back to life, but wrote the wrong first name. They called him this new name when he was at the hospital for days, until we told them they did not have the right name. He also time travels. He's back in jail now and constantly calls me from the past to ask me if his parents are still alive. Great guy. Story 85. I worked at a behavioral rehabilitation center. We had an addict. They accidentally placed him with us instead of a high-security substances rehab, and it was a doozy of an experience that ended him in juvenile detention. His withdrawals were so bad, and his complete lack of empathy and care to get clean due to his upbringing in Southern California caused him to be hyper-violent. We're an institution meant for kids who skip school too much or are super manipulative and hard to deal with. I should also explain how he ended up at such a place. The reason he was detained was because he wasn't going to school. The California education system doesn't care why, just that you aren't. Story 86. I lived at a residential treatment center from the ages of 14 to 15 while being treated for severe chronic depression. There was a girl who lived in my building with schizophrenia, and oftentimes you'd see her flirting with the voice in her head. She'd be sitting there muttering to herself, smiling and twirling her hair in her fingers and batting her eyelashes. I didn't think much of it at first, until I found out later that the only voice she heard in her head was that of her father's, who had abused her. After finding that out, it was severely sad and creepy whenever it happened. Story 87. I used to work in an adolescent ward. The kids ranged from 5 to 25, so the day-to-day was absolutely nuts. We used to work one-on-one with the kids with 8-hour shifts, and I witnessed my friend working with this 14 girl on schoolwork. Well, she got frustrated and started throwing a tantrum in the middle of the floor, which we were totally used to. What we weren't used to was this young lady sticking her hand in her mouth and lost her finger. Quit that week. $11 an hour wasn't worth taking my lunch breaks in my car every day to cry.